Tennessee, the winding path to an established self-governance. In 1783, the American Revolutionary War concluded with the American colonies establishing their freedom from Britain. The United States did not exist yet, and the Continental Congress was a de facto ruling party without much power. The future of the colonies was not established yet, and even more so were the settlements in lands far west of them, such as the Watauga and Cumberland communities. The events that took place between 1783 and the official establishment of Tennessee's statehood in 1796 established important precedents for creating new states out of Western territories. The need for statehood in Tennessee was motivated by settlers in the wilderness seeking security, protection of property, and a positive financial future with legitimacy among other governments. After the American War was won and colonists could start thinking about a future with more freedoms than they had ever experienced before, land ownership was at the forefront of most people's desires. With the eastern seaboard of North America rapidly getting claimed and populated, many sought open lands further west. According to the Tennessee history textbook, with the proclamation line no longer enforced, restless, land-hungry folks in the now independent state could move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Moving west offered the tantalizing opportunities, a chance to start over, and a chance to own land that meant equality to many. British laws no longer stopped them. No longer were there bureaucrats thousands of miles away dictating what was allowed or restricted. However, this did not mean that people seeking land west of the Appalachian Mountains encountered no resistance. Indeed, many of the problems they encountered were not just from a dangerous environment, but from a lack of connectivity with the outside world. According to one historian, settling land may only have required a willingness to endure the requisite challenges, but legitimizing those settlements was more complicated. Successful commerce was a critical factor in sustaining settlement in areas that were geographically isolated from major market centers. With the mountains creating a natural obstacle to eastern markets, Mississippi River access became essential for frontier participation in both domestic and Atlantic commerce. There were complications at every turn that made the future of the Tennessee area uncertain, and no obvious solutions that would provide for the safety and rights of the settlers there. The future of the wilderness area of the Appalachians was uncertain for several years after the North American colonies had expelled the British, and the possibility of becoming a piece of a larger nation was not guaranteed. Historian Jason Farr made a point about this fact, saying, "The reality of American independence left trans-Appalachian communities in a unique situation. They had the opportunity of creating jurisdictions within existing states, forming new states within the Union, or creating their own sovereign republics. It was never assumed that these areas would join what became the United States. It might seem surprising from a modern perspective that additional states, or even the growth of the original colonies into one federation nation, was not a sure thing at that point in time. The textbook clarifies the status of America at that time by stating that the Articles of Confederation had created a Congress primarily for the purpose of fighting the war, but there were no provisions for settling disputes between the colonies, for paying the war debts, managing trade not only with other countries, but also between the states themselves. The people dwelling in sparse settlements between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River had several options to consider for their future, and statehood was only one option, but it was not certain whether the future federal government could provide for their specific needs. The needs of the settlers in the Watauga and Cumberland settlements were decreasingly about basic survival and increasingly about securing their future on a political and economic stage. Historian Jason Farr stressed their needs for legitimacy in the eyes of various governments, domestic and foreign alike. Securing political legitimacy and commercial prosperity for communities west of the Appalachian Mountains required more than a few speculators consolidating their wealth in a fledgling state. Ultimately, the increasing number of settlers would have to consent to some governing body, whether an existing state, a new state within the Union, Spain, or even a new Western republic. In order for speculating elites to pursue various land schemes and sustain their governing legitimacy, they had to convince ordinary people that they were capable of securing their settlements and liberties. It was of great concern that these isolated settlements needed to deal deal with their distant mother state of North Carolina, treaties and disputes with Native American tribes, and also with the powerful presence of Spanish settlements to the south and west. Spain was an especially formidable presence which could have affected the Western Territory positively or negatively. The textbook states that with the war over and Great Britain no longer having colonies along the east of the Mississippi River, the settlers feared that Spain was going to close the Mississippi River to Americans. If Spain did close the Mississippi River, it would be disastrous for the Cumberland settlers who relied on the river to transport its crops to market. Before trying to establish an independent state, the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River still belonged to the state of North Carolina. However, the fledgling state had great concerns over its established eastern communities than it did for the western wilderness. The textbook said that, like many of the other states, North Carolina had incurred debt during the war with no way to pay its creditors. The state had difficulty providing the most meager of services for citizens living east of the Appalachians and seemed to have little concern for the welfare of those citizens living beyond the mountains. Sustaining the Watauga and Cumberland settlements was simply unfeasible and too expensive for the distant North Carolina government. From one source video, it was noted that North Carolina did not want the trouble and expense of maintaining such distant settlements, embroiled as they were with hostile tribesmen and needing roads, forts, and open waterways. Nor could the far-flung settlers look to the national government for only the weak, loosely constituted Articles of Confederation. It was a government in name only. The result was that North Carolina often neglected or outright ignored the needs of the Western settlers. The apparent abandonment by North Carolina left many settlers feeling unprotected or even threatened by actions and inactions that were taken. When North Carolina interfered with peace negotiations with the natives, the prospective founders of the state of Franklin declared, "The Assembly of North Carolina have detained a certain quality of goods, which was procured to satisfy the Indians for the lands we possess, which detainure we fully conceive has so exasperated them that they have actually committed hostilities upon us, and we are alone compelled to defend ourselves from these savages." Besides interfering in negotiations with Native American tribes, the Franklinites perceived that a state of general lawlessness had descended upon the region once North Carolina ceded their western territory to Congress in the Cession Act of 1789. This further angered the Franklinites, who described it as the Secession Act, which has thrown us into such a situation that the influence of the law in common cases was almost a nullity, and criminal jurisdiction had ceased entirely, which reduced us to the verge of anarchy. Over a short period of time, North Carolina had gone from not providing for their western territories to interfering with progress and finally to actual abandonment. Their former western settlements were fed up and ready to formally cut all ties with North Carolina. The actions of the parties involved with the initial attempt of statehood with the state of Franklin were seen as the most western settlers as positive moves towards security with the establishment of land rights. Historian Jason Farr stated that Western separatists, like those in the state of Franklin, were responding to the inability of states to provide legitimate legal and political authority. Independence to procure and secure property required the institutional support of governing institutions. It was when these proved unavailable that evidence of Western separatism becomes particularly notable. It had become painfully obvious by this point that the solution to being too far away from North Carolina to be properly run and governed was to separate and become an independent state. The founders of the state of Franklin described it pointedly as being incompatible with our interest to belong in union with the eastern part of the state, for we are not only far removed from the eastern parts of North Carolina, but separated from them by high and almost impassable mountains, which naturally divide us from them, which have proved to us that our interest is also in many respects distinct from the inhabitants on the other side and much injured by union with them. The state of Franklin was short-lived, but it made the important step of proving that the settlers of the Southwest Territory were ready and determined to establish their own independent government rather than continuing to rely on those who did not hold their best interests at heart. Once the state of Franklin failed, the elite among the western settlements became aware of what was needed to establish a state within the Union. These elite were mostly wealthy landowners who were looking out for their best interests and not just what the common folk would need. After a census and vote on statehood had been taken, they assembled in Knoxville to draw up the Constitution of Tennessee, and it should be noted that most of the delegates were involved in land speculation and hoped that statehood would raise the value of their own land holdings. They agreed that all property would be taxed equally, no matter what improvements might have been put on the land. The future of taxation, property value, and land rights were at the foremost concerns for these Constitution writers. Another consideration that would affect the future prosperity of the new state was access to trade networks. An important right included in the draft was a statement saying that all residents of the state had free navigation of the Mississippi River. The future of wealthy landowners was thus secured as an integral part of the foundation for the free and economically stable state of Tennessee. The path to statehood for Tennessee was a rough ride, troubled mostly by the location being far away from the established colonies. Becoming a state in the Union was not guaranteed and was only one of several options for the territory now freed from British influence but riddled with danger from Native American tribes and the presence of the Spanish to the west. The settlers sought the help of their mother state of North Carolina, but that help evaporated as North Carolina focused on their own issues east of the Appalachian Mountains, eventually ceding the Western Territory to Congress to pay for debts. Frustrated settlers gradually determined that creating a new state with laws to protect land and trading rights were in their best interests, which led first to the creation of Franklin and eventually to the state of Tennessee. Tennessee's path to statehood was motivated by the need of settlers in the wilderness to secure their autonomy, land rights, and economic future to have legitimacy among other governments. Thanks for watching!